Well, good evening. It is wonderful to be able to address you again. I'm very thankful for those who have been here so many of the nights, those who have been such an encouragement to not only me, but the entirety of the group here at Hammond. I'm glad that we were able to study these things and think about these things together. It is always a great encouragement to get to meet family that we have in different places. And so when you go to another congregation and you speak to saints in another place, it's really not like meeting new people. It's like meeting extended parts of your family. It's kind of like a family reunion, and I'm very glad to have met new members of the family that I did not meet last time I was here, and also to return back to those who I had met last time I was here. You guys have been an encouragement, continue to be that. The congregation at Wildercroft is all going to be very interested to hear about how things go, and I'm very thankful that I'm able to report so many good things to them. One of the great things about being in fellowship with other congregations is it's just great to be able to hear how another group is doing, since we do not have any kind of head over our groups, but we are independent. It is still great to be able to hear from our brothers and sisters in other places, and I'm very looking forward to being able to communicate to them. One of the neat things about the commonality that we share is that basic mission statement that we are trying as hard as we can to be the church that Jesus started. And we are looking to the things that are written in Scripture about that church, about those saints, so that we can emulate them to the best of our ability. And so in talking about the gospel, one of the things that we have been paying attention to is our role in this, how it is all of our responsibility together, and how we all fill different roles. I mentioned before that not everyone has the same level of extroversion or introversion, and so we all work together as a body so that the gospel can continue to be taken to the rest of the world. And when we work together in this way, it is amazing how often the efficacy of the gospel is demonstrated, because not only are we showing other people that we work together like a body, but my deficiencies are made up by so many of my brothers and sisters. This is not only true in the local body, but sometimes when you have someone who hears the gospel and moves to another place, and you're able to hear how another church picked up where things may have started, and you're just happy to see how this works in every place. And so I'm very thankful to be able to talk about these things. They're not only sharp and sometimes a bit of a goading in the right direction, but they're also talking about these things can also be an encouragement for us to continue on with the things that we have been doing. When we think about the gospel, one of the things we've talked about is our part in it. But that already understands that the idea that the gospel needs people to carry it. I don't know if you've ever thought about how weird that is. I talked to Bill a lot this week. We talked about it to other people. The Almighty God, the creator of the entirety of the universe, the very definition of wisdom and power, has deigned to be able to speak to human beings in language that our small, tiny little brains can understand. He wrote down his eternal will, the same will that created the entirety of the plan of salvation, the cosmos, the things that we cannot see with the greatest of our telescopes. All of those things were according to his will. And yet with that eternal and magnificent will, he narrowed down everything so that he could tell us about what he wants from us. And you think about the limitations he put on himself, he can't communicate those things to us. And when you think about that, then it kind of makes sense that the gospel, the good news of who he is and what he provides for every human being, also requires people to carry it. God could have made the gospel work any way he wanted to, okay? He was not limited in how it went, but he limited it intentionally, so that it is carried from human being to human being. So we are responsible for this, but God did that on purpose. We did not decide, we're going to be people who take the gospel. No, God was the one who designed this system. And so it might seem strange to our ears that the gospel requires people to carry it. But if you think about the way that this is in Scripture, it talks about this in Isaiah chapter 52. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. This brings good news is evangelizo, the evangelism concept. We get the word gospel through Middle English because it just means good news. The word gospel just means good news. And so all of these ideas are present even all the way back in Isaiah. Of course, Isaiah sometimes jokingly referred to as the fifth gospel because so many of the gospel promises start there. But that means that even when he was talking about how the gospel was going to go out before Jesus or even John the Immerser appeared on the scene, God was talking about the fact that the gospel was going to go through people to other places. Oh, how lovely on the mountains the feet of him who brings good news. Paul references this in Romans chapter 10. I was supposed to change that and I didn't. I made a mistake there. But Romans chapter 10, he quotes this in talking about needing people to take the gospel to other people. Now, in that case, he's probably talking about preachers who are meant to send, to take the word into the world. But I want to note that a lot of the gospel work is done by people who are not so fully supported evangelists. Now, I know that the word is literally in evangelist. It's like, well, you're the gospel preacher. That's what you do. You're the evangelist. But if you think about it, a whole lot less of the gospel would get carried if only the preachers were the ones doing it. You think about your own situation. You think about your own conversion. It was a whole lot more than just a preacher who influenced your life and made it so that you could hear the gospel. There are some people who were converted by a convincing preaching. That's true. But more often than not, when you talk to people, how did you hear the gospel? They talk about someone they knew. They talk about someone who was not a preacher. Sometimes it was family. Sometimes it was a friend at work. There's always this story that involves a whole lot more than just a fully supported evangelist. Therefore, the gospel is really everybody's responsibility. Many of us forget that we are a part of this network that is responsible for serving the good news. And sometimes when we forget that, we don't take our responsibilities seriously. But I want us, and we've been talking about this week, we all serve the gospel in our lives because we all have a part to play in it. But to do that effectively, and this is where we started off our series, we need to have the right attitude for serving the gospel. Now, this evening, what I want to do is I want to look at an account where one man was to hear the good news from an authorized speaker, but it would not have happened at all if it was not for the service of other people. That is, there were a lot of people who worked together to make sure that someone heard the gospel and was then saved. But it wasn't exactly the gospel as we might think about it. In 2 Kings 5, go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 5, if you will. We're going to begin there in just a moment. 2 Kings 5. I think most of us are familiar with the account of Naaman, who was this warrior who was receiving relief from the plague of leprosy by the command of Elisha the prophet. We need to remember, first of all, that leprosy in this case is not necessarily just Hansen's disease, but it's kind of an umbrella term for a lot of other infectious skin diseases. And we're not told exactly which one he has. We just know that he is afflicted with it, and he wishes he was not. But Naaman hearing the good news would not have happened without the work of three or more, at least three different servants. Now, many times in churches like ours, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with this account from that standpoint, we're familiar with the account of Naaman, who was dipped in the Jordan 7 times, and we talk about it kind of as a prefiguring of baptism and the faith that is required for that to be accomplished. But in this, and we might not always think about this, there is also a lot of important lesson for us about how the gospel comes into the lives of people. A lot of times we consider ourselves above service. And when we consider ourselves above service, we only end up serving ourselves. No one likes to think of themselves as being a servant unless we have the right kind of attitude. I'm interested in some newer translations of Scripture that have taken out the word servant and replaced it unilaterally with slave. And I have been interested in the kind of people in churches like ours who don't like that kind of language. Well, I'm not a slave. Why would I be a slave? You're a slave. You're a slave to Christ. We're supposed to be a slave to Christ. We give up self so that we can be a slave to Christ. If we are uncomfortable with that idea, then we need to do some work about thinking about our appropriate place in this. Sometimes if we don't get anything out of the deal, we find ways to excuse ourselves from service. It's not that we would necessarily feel like we're above it, but we don't see where we get anything out of it, so we find a way to get out of it. Sometimes we take the other approach completely, and we might serve as long as we get something out of the deal. So coming to our account in 2 Kings chapter 5, I want to note that there was a helpful handmaiden, and when we think about what her work was, that she was seeking a solution for somebody else. Chapter 5 of 2 Kings, starting in verse 1. Now, Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram. At this point, Aram is the enemy of Israel. They are what we would call Syrians. They are to the northeast of Israel, and they have been a pain for a long time. We're going to note that they have been such a pain that they have been attacking Israel with raiding bands. They've been encroaching upon their land and just stealing things on horseback and taking it all back home. And really, Israel hasn't been able to do a lot about it. So Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected. Because by him, Yahweh had given a victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. That is, he had leprosy. Again, an umbrella term for lots of skin afflictions. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and taken a captive little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Samaria at this point is the capital city of the northern kingdom. This is during the divided kingdom period. You've got Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Largely, Israel is in bad shape spiritually, and they have been that way for a while. The only people who are really kind of pulling them the other way are these prophets that were authorized by Yahweh. You've got Eliyahu, and then or Elijah, and he hands the reins over, or the mantle, literally, to Elisha, who comes after him. And so these prophets, these authorized spokesmen for God, are trying to pull the spiritual condition of the entire country a little bit back toward God with, limited success. But here you have someone who says, I wish my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. She said to her, in verse 4, Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus spoke the little girl who is from the land of Israel. The king of Aram said, Go now, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see, he is seeking a quarrel against me." At this point he says, "Oh no, the Arameans are picking a fight. They've given me an impossible task. And this is going to cause war. It's going to cause all kinds of problems." Verse 8, "It happened when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent word to the king saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel.'" I want to think about a few things in this account. First of all, let's note that this is one of the most amazing demonstrations of faithfulness in the whole Bible. The loving words of this humble handmaiden, this humble slave girl, started Naaman on his quest to obtain healing from this sickness that he could not get anywhere else. This little girl, slave girl, was even in Aram and even in her place of service due to a raid by the Arameans. And yet, even in that position, she readily serves God and her masters with unquestioning faithfulness. I just want to think for just a minute. If anyone here could imagine a situation in which you had an invading army come, kill people, burn things, and steal children away to a foreign land, what kind of attitude might the children have who were stolen from their parents, stolen from their land, taken away and made to serve the enemy? Do you think that they would be inclined to help? Do you think that they would be inclined to say sweet and kind things to their masters? I can only imagine if she hears that Naaman has leprosy, she might say, "Well, serves you right, buddy. It's what you get for being such a bad person." But that's not what she does. Here she says, "I wish my master was in Israel." Why? Because he could obtain the help that is only available there. There are people who will turn on God and question their faithfulness at the slightest hint of adversity. Things don't go their way, and they quit trying to be right. This little girl not only believed in God's power, but even when she was a kidnapped slave, she suggested that her mistress's husband seek out God's prophet and told him where to find him. How quick would we be to reach out to the family of those people who owned us as a kidnapped slave? This little girl had every excuse to be bitter and unhelpful, but she was neither. She was loving, and she was dedicated to serving. So a kidnapped servant was kind enough to see the sickness present in her mistress's husband, or the sickness that he suffered. And she cared enough to share the solution with him. She may not have been able to do the work herself, but she knew someone who did, and she had faith that it would be provided. Naaman's reaction, I think, demonstrates a level of trust that he had in the little girl. I want to note, it says that he went to his master. But we know who his master is for the first couple of verses. His master is the king of Aram. I just want to think for just a minute what it would sound like. He goes to the king of a more powerful nation, and he says, "Hey, there's this little slave girl. She works for my wife. She says that I can go to Israel, and they got a prophet who can cure this." That is so much trust. It's interesting how often we will discount younger people and the things that they say. As adults, you get older, and the kids will say stuff, you go pat them on the head and say, oh, that's cute, okay, whatever. And I think that sometimes we're even worse when we talk to younger women. Little girls oftentimes will just really, really discount them. He doesn't do this. He doesn't discount what she says. He takes it all the way to the king. Now, that's a short step to the king, but he takes it to the king. What an embarrassing situation if it had all been just kind of made up nonsense. He trusts her that much, that she was not only not bitter, but that she was right about the situation. This, in a lot of ways, kind of touches some places we've already been looking at this week. The things which you have heard from me in the front of many witnesses, entrust these things to faithful people who will teach others also. What an amazing demonstration of that same principle is true in this little girl. She knew the truth, and all she did was speak it to people who were in her life. Here she sees a situation where someone needs something, and she says, I know what the solution is, and she just says it. The passage that has been kind of the theme for our week in 1 Peter chapter 3. I know that we focus on this readiness to give an answer, and we have, and we talked about what kind of questions can prompt that. And we can see in this little girl, she shows us humble and dedicated service can give us that opportunity to share our hope. She is the shining example of exactly what we have been noticing this whole week. Obviously, her record of service made it so that people trusted her. She behaved with kindness and loyalty and faithfulness in incredibly unfair circumstances. She showed that she could be trusted, and she talked about the hope that was in her. We need to live in a way that doesn't violate our conscience, obviously, but we need to have an unassailable character, such that when we say something, someone would trust what we say to take it all the way up, if necessary. If we don't behave with honesty and integrity, no one's going to take our word on anything. I want to think about some other servants in this account. Coming back to 2 Kings chapter 5, I want to think about some servants who answered some very real objections. We'll talk about what kind of objections they are, starting in verse 9. So back to 2 Kings chapter 5. And if you want to keep a marker here, we will keep coming back here. So 2 Kings chapter 5 again, we're going to pick up in verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you and will be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of Yahweh his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, Wash and be clean? So he went and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. In his anger about Elisha's unimpressive solution, Naaman brought up some critical complaints. And they're not critical because they're valid. They're critical because they almost stopped him from being healed. Think about what a precipice that he was on at this point. Okay? Here he was. The solution was in sight. He was told exactly how to solve this problem. He was told exactly what he needed to do, and it would solve everything. And it almost didn't happen because he was mad. He was mad because the solution sounded too simple to him. The solution was not impressive enough to him. He's let down because the reality of the prescription He doesn't even meet Elisha at all. It doesn't match up with any of his preconceptions. I love how he says this. Now, if I'm Naaman, I understand a little bit of where he's coming from. He is an important man. He works for the king of Aram. He is used to having the proverbial red carpet rolled out for him everywhere he goes. When he shows up, people get scared, and some of them get dead. He is someone who is used to commanding respect. Not only does Elisha give him a very simple thing to do, Elisha doesn't even come outside. He sends his servant out there to talk to him. Now, I used to think that this was something just to kind of tweak Naaman a little bit. But I don't anymore, because Elisha really oftentimes does not meet with people face to face. I don't think he's much of a people person. He sends his servant more often than not. I just think he's kind of just one of those people. He's just not a people person. And you might think, well, that's weird for the prophet to be like that. Well, read the accounts. Elisha is not much of a people person. But in this case, it works perfectly for the way that this has to go. You have to have someone who is challenged by this. And when he talks about the fact that the rivers of Israel, especially the Jordan, are not that impressive, he's not kidding. If you've ever seen the Jordan, it looks like chocolate milk. It does not look like something you want to go bathe in. It is not a pretty river from that standpoint. He says, I've got prettier rivers where I'm from. I could go back there and wash. I love these servants. The servants who cared about Naaman's condition addressed these angry arguments. The arguments, of course, I think tell us that this is a real account. This is human behavior. This is exactly how someone who's important would react to that situation. I want to notice how much respect they have for him, even as angry as he is. Not only do they call him father, they work hard to get him healed. You can find a way to explain away a lot of how people treat Naaman in the account. The Aramean king needs him. Why? Because he's successful. He gets the job done. That guy, he's a mighty warrior. I trust this guy. I need him to be okay. So I can see why he treats him with so much respect. You have Elisha. Elisha has a reason. He wants there to be known that there is a prophet in Israel. So there's a reason why he's involved in this. But I want to notice how many other people are just around just to help him get well. There is something about the way that he carries himself that makes other people want him to be okay. And this is not just lip service. They genuinely want him to get well. They care so much that when they hear all these angry arguments, they say, well, hold on a minute. Let's think about this for just a minute before you give up. Keep a marker here, and if you will, turn over to John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, we have an account of a few other objections that are being handled. In John chapter 1, start reading in verse 43. In verse 43, the next day he purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael, and he said to him, "We have found him, of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph." We found him. The Messiah we had been waiting on. He's here. We knew it was going to be happening during the time of Rome. We read Daniel. We know what we're looking for. Here, he has showed up. Come meet the Messiah. Nathanael said to him, "A good thing come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Of course, we have this back and forth where Jesus also speaks to Nathanael. Nathaniel considers himself kind of a skeptic, and Jesus blows some holes in that pretty fast. Jesus does that with a lot of different people. But I love in this account, these objections are being handled by someone who is serving the good news. Philip answers Nathanael's objection with an invitation to investigation. I know you've got complaints. I know that you're thinking this is not very impressive, but come and see. Nathanael wasn't angry like Naaman was, but he brought up objections about the hometown of Jesus, and they could have been just as critical. They could have just as well stopped him from finding about the truth of the Messiah. If Philip had not cared enough to address these complaints, these objections, Nathanael could have stayed ignorant. Philip did not need to answer every one of the objections that Nathanael brought up. I think that's important. Sometimes we get caught up in all of the objections that someone might bring. And we think we have to answer every one of their objections. What Philip does not do is does not turn around and talk about good things that have already come out of Nazareth. Well, you got this thing, and there's this cream I like that they've got all over there. They've got a couple of shops and stuff. We sold a lot of fish. He does not talk about how great Nazareth is. He doesn't feel like he has to. What does he say? Just come look. That's all you need to do. And sometimes I think that we fail to do that. People will bring up objections about the gospel. They will bring up objections about Jesus. They will throw up a bunch of flack, and we might be tempted to say, well, I have to answer every one of their arguments. No, you don't. Because what you can say is, come find out. Just look at it. Just read it. I talked to somebody not too long ago who had kind of got up in a lot of the atheist movement when they were young. And really, it just came down, they had a lot of objections, they had a lot of things that were problems. But what changed things was not someone answering every one of their arguments. It was someone saying, just read the Bible. And then they started to read the Bible. And that made the difference. I think sometimes we think we have to be a whole lot more clever than we have to be, or that we are. Just come read it. That's going to change things. Just come see. I want to talk about somebody else over in John chapter 7. So the same gospel, but over in chapter 7. I'm not going to read the entirety of this, but a couple of sections from this. In verse 25 of John chapter 7. So some of the people were saying, is this not the man whom they are seeking to kill, that is the Pharisees? Look, he is speaking publicly, and they're saying nothing to him. The rulers do not really know that this is the Christ, do they? However, we know where this man is from, but wherever the Christ may come, no one knows where he's from. So there's some back and forth about that. Jesus cried out in the temple, teaching and saying, you both know me and know where I am from. I have not come for myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me. So they were seeking to seize him, and no man laid his hands on him because his hour had not yet come. Verse 31, well, many of the crowd believed in him, and they were saying, when the Christ comes, he will not perform more signs than those which this man does. Really? The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to seize him. So that they had this back and forth among the people, and here they sent someone to go arrest Jesus. Now, they come back in verse 45, and we can read about how that exchange goes. The officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said to them, why did you not bring him? The officers answered, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. There's some other translations that render this even more brief, and I love it. Never man so spake. No one talks like this guy. So here you have the guys who were sent to arrest him, and they come back, and what do they say? Well, where is he? You don't get it. Nobody talks like this guy. That was their answer for not arresting him. He talked himself out of it. It's hard to see how that all worked out, but when you read about Jesus answering people's objections, you kind of get it. But the officers were right there with him, and they came back without him and said, nobody talks like this guy. Now notice how the Pharisees answer this. Pharisees answered them, "You have not also been led astray, have you?" In verse 47. "No one of the rulers or Pharisees has believed in him, has he? But this crowd which does not know the law is accursed." Doesn't that sound like a lot of modern arguments? Look at the logical fallacies. The appeal to expert. Well, the experts don't believe it, therefore it can't be true. Here, the guards have spoken with Jesus. They've seen him. They heard him talk. And they came back and said, "Look, this guy is different from everybody else in the entirety of human beings." But the people who had not been there with him, they are way on their side and going, "The experts don't believe it." And they turn around and they make fun of the people who do believe. This crowd that doesn't know the law, they're all accursed. Maybe you've heard that kind of objection too. You talk about Jesus and they say, "Look, historians don't really believe in Jesus, and they're the experts on this thing." Or they'll say, "Well, those people who do believe in Jesus, they're all a bunch of dumb hicks and rubes. I mean, only dumb people really go to church anymore." Nicodemus, on the other hand, verse 50, he who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, "Our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he's doing, does it?" They answered him, You're not also from Galilee, are you? Search and see that no prophet rises out of Galilee." There are so many ways that they're wrong. I don't have time to talk about how wrong they are on that one, but they are incredibly misled on this. Amid all these objections, there are people who could plainly see the truth about Jesus. Here they can see the logic of it. Nobody's going to beat this guy as far as miracles goes. It's obviously he's the guy. They said out loud the things that they saw. And Nicodemus addressed these critical objections that are being brought up by the unbelieving Jewish Sanhedrin. I want to note that Nicodemus is still working through his own issues from chapter 1. I love Nicodemus so much. To see his progression throughout the book of John is one of the beautiful subplots of the gospel. In John chapter 1, he's got some things he says to Jesus. He's not done baking. Here in John chapter 7, he has to see some things to say about Jesus, but he's not done baking yet. And we don't really see him coming to a place of actionable faith until John chapter 19. He's a real good example of the long play evangelism. Some people are not converted overnight. Sometimes they take a while. And Nicodemus is a good example of that. I like that he takes the same approach that Philip does with Nathanael, though. He asked him to investigate, instead of just sitting on the outsides and taking pot shots. He even goes back to the law of Moses to make his point. It's probably why they get so upset with him. They said the law says you guys are really not giving this guy a fair shake. Now I want to notice that at the point that Philip addresses the equation, and Nicodemus too, neither one of them are really evangelists by trade. But they were ready to answer when people had objections. And it made a difference. In the case of Nicodemus, it may not have made a difference to the Sanhedrin, but it made a difference in Nicodemus. He doesn't have to answer every one of their accusations. What does he say? Just find out. Just see for yourself. I want to talk about a third servant, and I wish it was as positive as the other example we looked at. It's not. It's actually a pretty terrible example. And coming back to our text in 2 Kings chapter 5. Start reading in verse 15. And we'll go ahead and finish up this chapter. When he returned to the man of God with all his company and stood before him, he said, "Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so please take a present from your servants now." Now remember, he was given a whole lot of gold. He was given a lot of riches. And here he's talking about it. He says, "Okay, I'm back. I know there's a God in Israel now. Take some of this stuff I brought with me." But he said, "As Yahweh lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Now Hammond said, "If not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules' load of earth, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offering nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to Yahweh. In this matter, may Yahweh pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, Yahweh pardon your servant in this matter. And he said to him, go in peace. So he departed from him some distance. I like that he says, I'm so happy about this. I've got all this wealth. Take some. No. Please, take some. He says, no. Can I have some dirt to go back with me so that I can feel like I'm still worshiping the real God by having some of the dirt from here? And, he doesn't really argue with him about that. The guy is really convinced. And he says, I just want to make sure it's always right. And even if I'm bowing, I'm not bowing for myself. I'm just helping the king do the bowing, and I want to make sure that that's okay. And Elisha says, no, don't worry about it. I mean, his heart is in the right place. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, behold, my master has spared this Naaman the Aramean by not receiving from his hands what he brought. As Yahweh lives, I will run after him and take something from him. So Gehazi pursued Naaman, and when Naaman saw one running after him, he came down from the chariot to meet him. He said, is all well? And he said, all is well. My master has sent me, saying, behold, just now 2 young men from the sons of the prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes. Naaman said, be pleased to take 2 talents. And he urged him, and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothes, and gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them before him. When he came to the hill, he took them from their hand, and he deposited them in the house. And he sent the men away, and they departed. But when he stood before his master, Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? And he said, your servant went nowhere. Then he said, did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it a time to receive money, and to receive clothes, and olive groves, and vineyards, and sheep, and oxen, and male and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence, a leper, as white as snow. Helping the hurting is not enough for some people because they're looking for something selfish. They're motivated by something that benefits them. Now, I want to think about just how easy it would have been to justify these actions. I mean, after all, he brought all that stuff that whole way. I mean, gold's super heavy. It would be a shame not to take a little bit, right? He doesn't even ask for the gold. It was just a little bit. He doesn't ask everything. It's just some. Just a fraction. It's a little bit. Just some. The problem isn't the amounts. The problem is the greed. The fact that helping someone wasn't enough. The glory of Yahweh was not enough. The name of God among the Arameans was not enough. He says, I also need something to fill my pockets. Now, it's never been a problem for the servants of God to make their living off of service. It's not a problem. It was true under the law. You had the priests be able to make a living. Under the New Testament, you have that demonstrated several times. So if Elisha refused in this case, it is obvious that he either A, didn't need it, or B, he had another good reason. But in any case, he said, no, we're not going to do that. But true servants of the good news don't distort the truth to secure physical gain. Gehazi showed who he was really serving. It wasn't God. It wasn't Naaman. It wasn't Elisha. He was serving himself. This is still something that we need to be cautious about, even in our understanding. Let's go ahead and look in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. First Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 3. Getting toward the end of his first epistle to Timothy, Paul says, if anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words or healthy teaching, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited, understands nothing, but he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For he brought nothing into the world, we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. If fleshly gain is our actual goal, then the truth will eventually be distorted. Timothy was instructed in this case to stay away from those teachers who are constantly busied with controversy and argument, because they're looking for a way to make a quick buck. And I've often thought before, what is the connection between those two? And now we know verse 10 about the love of money. That's a quote that's everywhere, right? But how is it connected to the rest of this stuff? How does he follow up those who are worried about controversy and then move over to looking for money? There is a lot of money that can be made in distorting the truth. There are people who will pay very, very good money to make sure that the truth is suppressed. Real, faithful disciples don't have time for all the nonsense and debates because they're too busy being focused on the truth. Now, I'm not saying that every debate is a nonsensical distraction. Some have to be had. There are times when we have to talk about some hard things. But some people are just spinning their wheels, trying to look busy so they can collect a paycheck because they're not out there getting the work done. And I hate to say this, but we have a serious problem among preachers with just this mentality. You see the way that people seem to like to start fights on social media. They're not talking to anyone about the gospel. They're having these bickering contests, and oftentimes in front of unbelievers. And you say, well, what in the world is that about? Why are they so busy doing that? Because it makes them visible. So when they want to leave the small church and go to the big church with all the money, their name's already out there. That has nothing to do with the gospel. I think it's important for us to realize we need to make sure that when we're talking to someone about the real gospel, we are looking for the benefit for them. We are looking for God's name to be proclaimed. Preaching and teaching as a method to secure gain is misguided, and it serves the self. And this applies to all servants of the gospel. And I want to make sure I make this clear. This is not only a problem for preachers. Yes, it is a problem for preachers, but it is not only a problem for preachers. Evangelism to seek temporary fleshly gains can also be something that a church can fall into. Sometimes when we start our evangelism workshops or our evangelism ideas, it has to do with a dwindling bank account. It has to do with the fact that we don't have enough numbers. We start to look at the physical representations and say, oh, we have to fix this and we have to do this fast. Now we need to be worried about evangelism. We need to get someone in here to teach us a new evangelism technique. We need to have new workshops. We need to have new methods. And if you think that churches will not sometimes evangelize out of looking for temporary fleshly gains, man, I have a beach house in Tucson with your name on it. We need to make sure that when we are evangelizing, we're doing it for the right reasons and we're serving the real God. We are serving the needs of the person who is desperately sick with sin. And we're making sure that the good news is really the goal in and of itself. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Some of the older translations will say mammon, the personification of wealth. We can only ever serve one master at a time, and serving God precludes the other necessarily. Evangelism is very important, but we need to make sure that we have our motivations clear in it. So who are we serving? Are we seeking a solution for those people who are hurting, stuck in, slaves of sin? Are we going to have the bravery to say the things that we know? We may not have all the answers ourselves, but we can invite people to take a look. Are we going to develop the character so that other people will take it seriously? Are we answering the objections of those people who have critical complaints? And I know, again, they may not be valid, but they can keep them from finding the truth if they go unanswered. Do we have enough care for those people to help them on their journey, or are we happy with them being derailed? Do we know the people in our lives? Do we know the material well enough to be able to answer some of those complaints that they have? Are we pursuing payment in the physical things, in the fleshly things? Are we serving the Savior, or are we serving ourselves? I am very thankful that I was invited here by Bill and the elders to be able to speak to you about this issue, about these things, about this topic. I'm hoping that these things help you see evangelism slightly differently. I know it may not be one of those practical things, and everyone says, oh, this is all you have to do. I've had people contact me this very week. They said, do you have any things on it? Do you have any schemes for evangelism? How do you do it? And they were looking for physical answers. And I said, be a saint. Develop relationships with people. Tell people about Jesus. It really is just that simple. That's all it is. But we have to do that. I'm thankful to have so many here who are here all this week. If this is the first time you've heard any of these things, or maybe the first time you've thought about these things, we want to talk to you more about them. We want to sit down with you and talk about what the Bible says, and the Bible will tell you the truth about life. That truth will change everything you know about this earthly existence. But if you know what it says, then you know what you need to do. Because this very evening, you can say out loud what you know to be true. Jesus is the King, He's the Savior, He's the Son of God, and I'm going to follow Him for the rest of my life. I'm going to take the good news with me. I'm going to confess His name before men. I'm going to confess Him when I am baptized, and I will confess Him the rest of my time on earth. I'm going to change. I'm going to do differently. I'm not going to live for myself anymore. I'm going to live for Him. And that change requires that I take my old life that I lived to this point, have that life crucified on the cross with Him, buried in the waters of baptism. And I ask God to raise me up a brand new creature, ready for a life in His name, ready for a life of service. If at one time you said you were going to do those things and you have not, if you have not maintained fidelity to that promise, there's an opportunity. Jesus still wants you. The congregation will encourage you. They will lift you up. They will pray with you. They will pray for you, not just tonight, but over and over and over again, until you finally have to say, okay, take my name off the announcements. They will pray for you. If this evening you have a spiritual need, you can make it known now as we stand and as we sing.